The dust of her father's life clung to everything in the barn, a fine, reddish powder that settled on the rafters, coated the unused tools, and filled the air with the scent of dry earth and old memories. For 18-year-old Clara, alone now in the vast, quiet landscape of the prairie, this barn was the last chapter of a book she never felt ready to close. Her father, a man of few words and calloused hands, had been gone for 2 months, taken by a fever that had swept through the valley with merciless speed. The townsfolk of Redemption Creek had offered their condolences, their casseroles, and their pitying glances, but soon their attention drifted, leaving Clara in the echoing silence of the homestead. She had the land, the small house, and this barn, a structure that felt as immense and hollow as her own heart. With her was Buster, her father's dog, a big, steady shepherd mix whose quiet companionship was the only thing that kept the loneliness from swallowing her whole. He sat near the wide-open doors, his head on his paws, watching her with intelligent, amber eyes as she began the overwhelming task of cleaning, of sorting, of letting go. It was a duty she had postponed, but the weight of it had become unbearable. Every cobweb, every stack of old harnesses, felt like an accusation. She started with the heaviest things first, wanting the satisfaction of visible progress. A large, iron-strapped feed bin sat in the corner, unused for years. It was too heavy to slide, so she decided to empty it, scooping out the last of the hardened, ancient grain. As she reached the bottom, her fingers brushed against the rough wooden floorboards, and one of them moved. It wasn't loose, it had shifted with a smoothness that suggested a hinge. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't experienced in months, sparked within her. She pushed aside the remaining grain and saw it, a small, inset iron ring, almost invisible against the dark wood. Buster lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest, not of aggression, but of alert attention. With a grunt of effort, Clara pulled. The board lifted, revealing not the dirt foundation she expected, but a square of profound darkness. A trapdoor. The air that rose from the opening was different. It was cool, still, and carried the scent of deep earth and stone, a stark contrast to the hot, dusty air of the barn. A sturdy ladder was bolted to the inside of the frame, its rungs disappearing into the blackness below. Fear warred with a desperate need to understand. Her father had been a simple man, a farmer who kept no secrets she knew of. This hidden place felt like a betrayal of that simplicity, a secret life lived beneath her very feet. Buster nudged her hand with his wet nose, whining softly, as if giving her permission, or perhaps courage. Taking one of the lanterns from a hook on the wall, she lit the wick, the small flame casting long, dancing shadows across the cavernous barn. She held it over the opening. The light caught the stone walls of a narrow, hand-dug staircase that descended about 10 feet before turning a corner. It was a place built with purpose, with immense effort. She had to know why. Securing Buster with a quiet command to stay, she hooked the lantern to her belt, took a deep breath that filled her lungs with the smell of lamp oil and mystery, and began her descent. The stone was cool to the touch, the silence absolute except for the scuff of her boots. As she rounded the corner at the bottom of the stairs, she lifted the lantern high, and its light bloomed outward, revealing a space that made her gasp. It wasn't a cellar. It was a room, a large, rectangular chamber with a packed earth floor and walls reinforced with thick, expertly laid stone. And it was filled. Along one wall stood dozens of sealed wooden barrels, each stenciled with a single word, water. Another wall was lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, laden with preserved foods in earthenware crocks sealed with wax, meats, vegetables, fruits, and grains. There were stacks of neatly folded woolen blankets, boxes of candles, spare lanterns, and carefully wrapped tools she didn't recognize. In the center of the room sat a small, efficient-looking iron stove, its pipe venting up into a cleverly disguised flue she hadn't seen from outside. This wasn't a hideout for treasure, it was a sanctuary for survival. A cold knot formed in her stomach. What had her father been so afraid of? In the weeks that followed, the shelter became Clara's obsession. The grief for her father was now mingled with a profound and unsettling curiosity. She found his journals tucked away in a small, built-in desk in the corner of the underground room. Page after page was filled not with personal thoughts or feelings, but with meticulous, practical instructions. He detailed schedules for rotating the water barrels, methods for checking the seals on the food crocks, and diagrams of the ingenious ventilation system that drew fresh air from a hidden pipe disguised as a rock formation 100 yards from the barn. He wrote of preparedness, of discipline, of the unforgiving nature of the land. But he never wrote why. The secret's purpose remained locked away. Her new routine did not go unnoticed. The people of Redemption Creek were used to seeing her work the fields or tend to the house. Now, they saw her spending hours in the barn, emerging covered in dust, her expression distant and serious. The town's chief source of news and opinion, a stern-faced woman named Beatrice Gable, was the first to comment. "The poor thing," she declared one afternoon at the general store, her voice loud enough for half the town to hear. "Grief does strange things to the mind. Her father's gone, and she's taken to living in the dirt like a prairie dog." The name stuck. Finn, a young ranch hand known more for his loud mouth than his hard work, took it up with glee. He'd tip his hat to her in the street, a mocking grin on his face. "Keeping the dust company, Clara," he'd call out, followed by the snickers of his friends. She became an object of pity and quiet ridicule, the orphaned girl who had lost her way. Even Mr. Avery, the town's quiet and observant blacksmith, would watch her from his smithy, his brow furrowed with a concern she couldn't decipher. He never joined the mockery, but his silent gaze felt just as heavy. She offered no explanations, knowing they would sound like madness. How could she explain a place she didn't understand herself? So she endured the whispers, finding solace in the quiet, methodical work below ground, with only Buster for company. Clara's world shrank to the dimensions of the homestead and the shelter beneath it. The town's mockery became a distant hum, easily ignored in the cool, silent chamber. She followed her father's journals as if they were scripture, learning the rhythms of the sanctuary he had built. She hauled barrels of water out, emptied them on her struggling garden, and refilled them from the well, painstakingly resealing them with fresh wax. She aired out the blankets in the hot sun, the scent of lavender and cedar filling the barn before she returned them to their neat stacks below. Buster seemed to understand the solemnity of the place. Down in the shelter, he was a silent sentinel, lying on a cool patch of the earthen floor, his ears twitching at the slightest sound from the world above. He was her shadow, her confidant, the only living creature who saw her work not as a symptom of madness, but as a continuation of a vital purpose. In a small, locked chest, she found more of her father's belongings, his spare spectacles, a whetstone for his knives, and a single, faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her mother, who had died when Clara was too young to remember. There was nothing else, no letter, no final message to explain his great, secret project. The lack of an answer was a constant, dull ache. Was it a memory of the harsh winters? A fear of bandits? Or was it something deeper, a wound from a past he had never shared? The work became a meditation, a way of connecting with the father she was only now beginning to know. Every task, from checking the flue on the stove to organizing the medical supplies, felt like a conversation with him. She learned the logic of his systems, the foresight in his planning. He had anticipated everything, the need for light, for warmth, for clean air, for sustenance. He had built a self-contained world, a fortress against a nameless fear. The townsfolk saw a girl retreating from life. In reality, she was immersing herself in her father's most profound lesson, though she had yet to understand what the test would be. The sky began to change. It started subtly, a shift in the quality of the light. The brilliant, searing blue of the prairie summer softened into a hazy, yellowish gray that clung to the horizon. The air grew thick and heavy, the usual dry breezes dying down until the world seemed to be holding its breath. Birds that normally filled the mornings with song fell silent. Cattle in the distant field stood motionless, their heads low. Clara felt the change in her bones. Down in the shelter, the air remained cool and still, but when she emerged into the barn, the oppressive weight of the atmosphere was immediate. Buster felt it too. He became restless, pacing the length of the barn and whining low in his throat, his gaze fixed on the strange, discolored sky to the west. He would press against her legs, seeking a reassurance she couldn't give him. In town, life went on with a willful ignorance. Finn and his companions laughed about the yellow haze, too much dust from the trail, he proclaimed at the saloon. Nothing a good rain won't fix. Mrs. Gable complained about the film of grime settling on her porch railings, blaming it on the lack of a recent downpour. But Mr. Avery, the blacksmith, stood outside his workshop, his hammer silent in his hand, his eyes narrowed as he studied the horizon. He saw what Clara saw, not just dust, but a warning. The sun became a pale, sickly disk, its heat felt but its light dimmed. A strange, metallic taste coated Clara's tongue when she was outside. She doubled her efforts, making one last check of every seal, every supply. She filled extra buckets with water and brought them down into the shelter, along with a bedroll for herself and Buster. She didn't know what was coming, but her father's journals, for all their practical advice, carried an unspoken urgency. His meticulous preparation was not for a vague possibility, it was for a certainty. The silence of the prairie was no longer peaceful. It was the deep, expectant quiet before a terrible roar. The world broke on a Tuesday afternoon. It began not with a sound, but with a color. The yellow-gray horizon to the west darkened to a bruised purple, then to a solid, roiling wall of black that seemed to consume the sky itself. It moved with an unnatural speed, a monstrous wave of earth and wind rising from the prairie. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. Then the sound came, a low, distant rumble that grew into a deafening, grinding roar, like 1,000 freight trains bearing down on their small, exposed town. It was a sound that vibrated deep in the chest, a physical presence that promised annihilation. Panic erupted in Redemption Creek. People ran from the street, fumbling with the doors and shutters of their homes. Finn, who had been laughing only an hour earlier, now stood frozen in front of the general store, his face pale with terror. The first gust of wind hit like a solid fist, tearing the hat from his head and sending a cloud of stinging, gritty dust into his eyes. Clara was already in the barn, Buster whining and pressing against her side. She had seen the wall of darkness coming. With a final surge of adrenaline, she heaved on the thick ropes that controlled the barn's massive doors, pulling them shut just as the storm hit. The impact was titanic. The entire structure shuddered, the timbers groaning in protest. A high-pitched scream of wind forced its way through every crack, and the air inside instantly filled with a suffocating, choking cloud of fine black dust. It was night at midday. The roar was absolute, swallowing all other sound. Clara lit a lantern, its small flame a flickering beacon in the swirling darkness. She grabbed Buster's collar, her heart pounding against her ribs, and pulled open the trap door. The calm, clean air from below was a promise of life. As they descended, she pushed the heavy door shut above them, the sound of the storm instantly muffled, reduced to a deep, subterranean rumble. Down in the quiet, steady light of the shelter, she finally understood. Her father hadn't been afraid. He had been a prophet. The town of Redemption Creek was being torn apart. The relentless, scouring wind, filled with a million tiny knives of sand and soil, stripped paint from buildings and shattered window panes. The roof of the general store began to peel away, its shingles flying off into the blackness like scattered leaves. Inside, the storekeeper and a handful of customers, including Finn, huddled behind the counter, listening to the destruction of their world. At her home on the edge of town, Beatrice Gable's carefully tended garden was obliterated in moments. The storm forced its way through the window frames, coating her polished furniture and fine china in a thick layer of black filth. She coughed, her lungs burning, the air too thick to breathe. People were trapped, isolated in their failing homes, the darkness outside total and the noise a physical assault on the senses. It was Mr. Avery who made the connection. His smithy, built of stone and iron, was holding firm, but he knew the wooden homes of his neighbors would not. He thought of the strange, quiet girl and her ceaseless work in her father's barn. He remembered the talk, the mockery about her living in the dirt. Suddenly, it wasn't madness. It was foresight. Wrapping a heavy leather apron around his face, he fought his way out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly knocked him from his feet, but he staggered on, his eyes slit against the blinding dust. He hammered on the doors of his closest neighbors, shouting over the roar. "Clara's barn! We have to get to Clara's barn!" A small, desperate group assembled, their faces masks of terror and disbelief. Mrs. Gable, her pride stripped away, joined them, her fine dress already tattered and filthy. Finn, choking and humbled, stumbled behind. They linked arms, a human chain against the apocalypse, and fought their way through the suffocating darkness toward the one place they had all dismissed, their last, improbable hope for survival. They reached the barn and pounded on the heavy doors, their cries for help nearly lost in the storm's fury. Inside the swirling dust of the barn, Clara heard the faint, desperate sound. Buster heard it first, his ears perking up, a low bark escaping his throat. She put a hand on his back to quiet him, her own ears straining against the howl of the storm. There it was again, a frantic, rhythmic banging. Someone was outside. Her first instinct was fear, but it was quickly replaced by a wave of compassion. No one could survive out there for long. Bracing herself, she unlatched the heavy bar and, with all her strength, pulled one of the massive doors inward just enough to create a small opening. One by one, they fell inside, collapsing onto the barn floor, choking, gasping, their eyes streaming. It was a small, terrified collection of her tormentors and neighbors, Mr. Avery, his face grim, Mrs. Gable, her hair wild and her clothes ruined, Finn, his bravado gone, replaced by a raw, childlike fear, and a few other families with wide-eyed children clinging to their parents. They stared at her, their expressions a mixture of desperation and awe. Without a word, Clara pointed to the trap door. She lifted it, revealing the calm, welcoming glow from the lantern she had left at the bottom of the stairs. Mr. Avery looked from the opening back to her, his eyes filled with a dawning, profound understanding. He helped the others to their feet and guided them toward the ladder. The descent from the screaming chaos of the barn into the absolute peace of the shelter was like stepping into another world. The air was clean and breathable. The temperature was cool and constant. The steady, silent light of several lanterns illuminated a scene of impossible order and peace. They saw the neat rows of supplies, the barrels of water, the stacks of blankets. Their mockery and whispers echoed in their minds, shaming them. The strange girl they had ridiculed was now their savior, moving with a quiet, confident grace in this impossible sanctuary. Clara handed a dipper of fresh water to a crying child, then to Mrs. Gable, who took it with a trembling hand, her eyes never leaving Clara's face. Buster sat calmly at Clara's feet, a furry anchor in a world turned upside down. In the silence of the shelter, broken only by the distant, deep rumble of the storm above, the townspeople looked at each other, and then at the young woman who had offered them mercy when they had only ever offered her scorn. Hours bled into one another in the subterranean calm. The storm raged on, its muffled fury a constant reminder of the world they had escaped. Clara moved through the shelter with a quiet efficiency that was both comforting and humbling to the small group of survivors. She distributed blankets, offered portions of preserved fruit, and spoke in gentle, reassuring tones to the frightened children. The townsfolk watched her, their earlier perceptions of her completely shattered. She was not the fragile, grief-stricken girl they had imagined. She was capable, strong, and possessed a wisdom that defied her years. Finally, during a period when the rumbling from above seemed to lessen slightly, it was Mr. Avery who broke the silence. He looked around at the meticulously organized shelter, a testament to years of labor, and then met Clara's gaze. His voice was soft, filled with respect. "Clara," he began, "your father, he built all of this. We never understood. Why?" All eyes turned to her. The question hung in the air, the one piece of the puzzle that remained. Clara walked over to the small wooden desk and retrieved the last of her father's journals. She opened it to a bookmarked page near the end, the paper worn and soft from repeated reading. Her voice was clear and steady as she read the entry aloud. October 12, 1868, she began. I was a boy of 10. The sky turned black at noon, just like the preachers warned of in the Bible. It was not a rain, but the earth itself rising up to swallow us. My father held the door, but the house was old. The dust came in, and it did not stop. It filled our home, our mouths, our lungs. I survived only because my mother pushed me into the root cellar and covered the door with her own body. When I emerged 2 days later, they were all gone. My parents, my sisters, buried in the black dust. I have seen the face of the world's anger. I will not let it take anyone I love ever again. This place is not built from fear. It is built from memory. It is a promise. She closed the journal. A profound silence filled the room. Mrs. Gable wept softly, not for herself, but for the quiet, lonely man she had so badly misjudged. Finn stared at the floor, his face a mask of shame. Her father hadn't been a paranoid eccentric, he had been a survivor, a guardian, a man who had transformed his deepest trauma into a legacy of protection for the very community that had never bothered to know his story. When the storm finally broke, it was after nearly 2 full days of darkness. The deep rumbling faded, replaced by an eerie, profound silence. Cautiously, Mr. Avery and Finn climbed the ladder and pushed open the trap door. The light that streamed into the barn was pale and weak, filtered through a haze of suspended dust, but it was daylight. They heaved open the main barn doors, and the survivors emerged, blinking, into a world transformed. Redemption Creek was almost unrecognizable. A thick blanket of black dust, several feet deep in places, covered everything, smoothing the landscape into soft, mournful dunes. Buildings were damaged, some severely, their bones exposed where the wind had torn away their skins. The world was rendered in monochrome, a silent, grey testament to the storm's power. But they were alive. Their homes were buried, their livelihoods uncertain, but their families were safe, thanks to Clara and her father. As they stood together, surveying the desolation, Finn turned to Clara, his head bowed, his voice thick with emotion. "We were fools, Clara," he said, unable to meet her eyes. "We laughed at you." I am so sorry. You saved us." Mrs. Gable stepped forward, her usual haughty demeanor replaced with a raw, genuine humility. She took Clara's hands in her own. "Your father was a great man," she whispered. "And you are his daughter. You have our thanks, and our deepest apologies." In the days that followed, the story of the shelter spread through the valley as other survivors emerged. The tale of Dusty Clara died, and in its place rose the legend of the girl who had saved Redemption Creek. The community, bound together by shared catastrophe and shared salvation, began the arduous process of digging out. But this time, they worked together. Finn organized teams to help clear the dust from homes, starting with Clara's. Mrs. Gable ensured that Clara wanted for nothing, bringing her meals and offering her a room in her own home until the town was habitable again. Mr. Avery began the long work of repairing the town's structures, often consulting with Clara about the clever engineering her father had used in the shelter. Clara, standing at her barn door with Buster faithfully at her side, was no longer an outsider. She was the heart of their new beginning, the quiet, steady center of a community that had learned a hard lesson about judgment and a beautiful one about the enduring power of quiet preparation and a father's love.